So I've been a professor of agroecology at the University of California since 1981, and I have worked on trying to come up with an alternative agricultural system that will be resilient and productive and biodiverse and socially just. At the world level, we have about 1.5 billion hectares of agricultural land. 80% of them are devoted to industrial agriculture, monocultures that have a huge ecological toll, dependent on external inputs, and also highly susceptible to many problems of diseases and pests and climate change. Despite the fact that we could be eating about 250,000 plants, rich plant diet that you were talking about, actually 50% of the food that we eat comes from three crops, which is basically rice, wheat, and corn. And it's not because we love those systems, those plants. It's because there's the whole food system that is basically geared towards the consumption of these three crops. These monocultures may have some temporary economic advantages, but in the long term, they're not sustainable. They're very vulnerable. As a matter of fact, in 1970, just here in the United States, there was a huge devastation of corn production because of its genetic homogeneity and its high susceptibility to diseases. So we lost a tremendous amount of food. But there are many other famines, like the Ireland famine, that was also due to the fact of the genetic homogeneity and vulnerability of the systems. And because of that, we have to use about 5 billion pounds of chemicals, pesticides, that are basically being injected into the biosphere, having all kinds of ecological impacts that I don't have time to go through. And there are other solutions that have come up saying that they're going to reduce the use of chemicals, for example, transgenic crops, which in 65% of the 200 million hectares of transgenic crops in the world are soybean, which actually condemns farmers to monocultures, because once you use Roundup, which is a broad spectrum herbicide, there's nothing that you can grow in between those crops. They're genetically engineered for that. But once you start applying Roundup, what happens, nature strikes back, and all the brown that you see there is soybean ready to be harvested. This is southern Brazil. And then the green are weeds that are resistant. Today we have about 12 species of weeds that are resistant to Roundup. So that gets farmers into a treadmill, and they have to use other herbicides, or they have to stack genes in order to make resistant to many other herbicides. So when we look at the actual cost of food or the externalities of industrial agriculture, we find that there's, in the US, for example, and in the UK, has been measured at about 208 pounds per hectare if we were able to internalize the cost of these effects, biodiversity loss, human health impacts, soil losses, water contamination, and air emissions, because actually industrial agriculture produces about 50% of the emissions when you account for transportation and processing of the food. And what's happening is that by the year 2030, 80% of the human population is going to live in cities. And the average age of farmers in the US is about 55 to 60 years old. So the question is, who is going to be the farmers of the future? How many farmers are going to be here? How many people are going to be farming here? 1? Okay. 2? 3? Do you have land available? Okay. That's a major issue. If you look at the Young Farmers Association of America, the main problem they have is access to land. So why is this important? Because the cities of more than 10 million people are going to triple in the world. And one city of 10 million people has to import 6,000 tons of food per day, which travels 1,000 miles on average. So that's totally unsustainable. For example, in the Bay Area, if a big earthquake comes and all the bridges fall down and the airports are not usable anymore, actually the food would last only one day in the supermarkets, and then there would be huge social riots. Then the other thing that we're seeing is that the industrial agriculture is very vulnerable to climate change. For example, in the last drought in 2012 was the worst in the western Midwest US. Actually, there was a loss of 30% production of soybean and corn production, which are mostly transgenic. And if you look at this curve, which is actually the curve of pride of US production, which is corn production, has been going up and up and up and up because of the injection of energy and so on. But you can see here in 2012, you can see that the production dropped because of the vulnerability to climate change, which is actually going to get worse. As a matter of fact, if we stop all the emissions today, we will not feel the effects until 50 to 100 years from now because of so much accumulated heat in the oceans. So California is also going through a drought, many acres out of production. many farm workers losing their work, and then hurricanes that are affecting, for example, Puerto Rico and the Caribbean, and obviously the hurricane that just happened here in the U.S. with devastating, effects on North Carolina. So what is expected is that by the year 2000, there are going to be about 16% loss in yields in average, and that the increase in food prices could actually go up to 150%. So what is interesting is that this industrial model of agriculture, although it uses 70% of the water, uses about 80% of the land, and uses most of the energy, 80% of the energy, actually only produces 30% of the food that we eat, because they are interested in producing biomass. They produce for cars, biofuels, or bioplastics, and other things like that. And we still have about 125 million people hungry, and we have a tremendous amount of food that's being wasted, that actually if we transported it today to Africa, it would solve all the problems of hunger there, if there was a magic way. And actually, on average, in the US, on average, we waste about 125 kilos of food per year. So if you look at the implications of food waste, we're actually using about 700 million hectares to grow that food that we're going to waste, around 1/4 of the water, 300 million barrels of petroleum, and we're producing 18% of greenhouse gases just to produce food that is going to be wasted. And on top of that, we have problems of obesity. As we have hungry people, but we have overfed people that are given the wrong industrial agricultural diet. So we can conclude, I conclude, this is not conclusions of UN, FAO, is that 6 decades of enormous waves of agricultural science and innovation have not solved the problems of hunger, the problems of poverty, and that the social and ecological toll of the Green Revolution has been enormous and have outstripped the benefits. Because one thing that happens is that when I give these talks, people argue that there were benefits of the Green Revolution. Yeah, but when you put it in the balance, actually there were more negative than positive. So what is the challenge of the future, which is now? The future is here, is that food production has to increase, not double, like everybody's saying. There's a big, actually, machinery that is saying that we need to double food production to feed the world today, because where did they get that data from when we have enough food today to feed everybody? If you account just for the food that is being wasted, and the problem is not production, the problem is poverty, the problem is lack of access to land, and other issues that are much more structural. And what's happening is that despite the fact that we need to increase production, which is not a sufficient condition, it's a necessary condition, we're not going to have enough land, we're not going to have enough nitrogen, and there's going to be a scenario of climate change that is going to affect production. So this challenge cannot be met with the existing industrial agricultural model and its biotechnological derivations. I subscribe to what Einstein said. You cannot solve the problem with the same mentality that created it. You have to come up with a new approach. Well, some people argue and say, well, Miguel, but what about biotechnology? Golden rice, for example. This is a good solution. For example, vitamin A is a deficiency in Asia. Young people are going blind. Why don't we produce a rice that actually would produce beta-carotene, which is a precursor of vitamin A, and then give it to the people? And that way we would solve the problem. Well, it sounds like an interesting idea. Well, when you look at the traditional systems of rice, actually, in these rice systems, not only they grow different varieties of rice, some of them have a lot of beta-carotene, some of the land races, but they have other components, many fruit trees, other plants, and fish and other things that actually, when people have this system, they don't have deficiencies of anything. What happens when you transform the landscapes into monocultures, which is what the Green Revolution did, this is what basically causes the problem. The root cause of the problem is the simplification of agricultural systems. As a matter of fact, some of these weeds that we call weeds in modern agronomy, and we try to eliminate them with herbicides, that are harvested by farmers in Asia and Latin America, also they call them quelites. They are for fodder, they're also medicinal, and they're also for feeding people. So when you look at the content of a leafy vegetable, for example, one of those weeds, you could have 400 micrograms per gram of beta-carotene, as opposed to, well, it used to be 1.6, now it's 37. So you have to eat about 2 kilos of the golden rice, which is actually yellow, and people are not used to eating yellow rice. Mostly they eat white rice. That's Anthropology 101. And second, in order to get what you would get from one leaf of one of those weeds that are being eliminated by the Green Revolution. And on top of that, when you start using the herbicides and all these other chemicals that are used in these monocultures, you eliminate these fish that play an important function, not only as a protein source, but they also control weeds, they control insects, and so on and so on. So the new paradigm also requires an ethics. And this comes directly out of Laudato Si, which is the encyclica of Pope Francis. I don't know if you've read the ecological encyclica. It's a very important document, not only for Catholics, for everybody in the world. And basically what he talks about is that we need to realize the right to food, which is a human right. And the second thing is that we need to challenge the right to private property, because there is a social function of the land. In many countries, like Brazil, for example, there is a social function of the land. That means if the land is not being used for agricultural production or is being being badly used, then is subject to expropriation to give it to the people that are going to produce food. So this is something that obviously in the United States would be something very shocking. But we need to move beyond, because there's a lot of land here in this country that could be used for food production, but there's not. For example, in Oakland, where I live, in Berkeley, California, there's 1,400 acres of abandoned public land in the city of Oakland, and that's where the most food deserts are. If we put all that land into agricultural production with urban agricultural methods that are used in Cuba, for example, we could feed about 400,000 people. But why is not that happening? Because it goes against the structure of the system that is entrenched. So we're looking for a new agriculture of the future, decoupled from fossil fuel dependence, agroecosystems that are friendly with nature, that are resilient to climate change, that are multifunctional, not only produce food, but produce ecological services, social services, maintain culture, knowledge, and the foundation of local food systems. So what we're looking for are systems that have high diversity, high productivity, and high efficiency that is given through the integration of the different components of animal production, crop production, and high recycling rates. So when we think about, do these systems exist? Well, in my experience in Latin America, small farmers have been farming that way for many years. So, when you think about a sustainable agriculture, resilient agriculture, just go there and the Andes, for example, or in Mesoamerica, and you find systems that have been existing for 5,000 years. That's true sustainability. And there's about 1.5 billion of these small farmers in the world, and they actually, their farms are less than 2 hectares. They have in their hands about 2 million varieties of crops. The Green Revolution only produced 7,000 varieties. So they have the genetic key for the future. And they produce 50 to 75% of the food depending on the country, actually using 25 to 30% of the land, using 30% of the water. So, why is it then that we don't give more land to peasants so that they can actually solve the problem immediately? Well, there are several constraints to that. And actually, if you look at this, this is total output of production. You can see that as you go, this is country after country, you will see that small farms have higher output than large farms. When I talk about total output, it's not the production of corn alone, because you could argue, well, here in Iowa or in the United States, we produce 15 tons of corn per hectare. Yeah, that's true. But the small farmer produces 1 hectare, so which one is more productive? But the small farmer, in addition, produces milk, produces vegetables, produces fruits, and so on and so on. That's total output. And the reason why the systems are so productive is because they are diverse, like the milpa, which is the corn bean association typical of Mesoamerica. There are a lot of ecological interactions that allow these systems to be actually more productive. So when you look at the productivity of corn or soybean in monoculture compared to the polyculture, you could say, well, this is more productive than monoculture than the polyculture, but in order to really calculate the real productivity of system, you have to use the land equivalent ratio, which tells you, in this case, using this formula, it gives you 1.5. That means you need 50% more land, or 50% more land than the monoculture. Than the polyculture. So if you need 1.5 hectares of monoculture to obtain the same productivity of 1 hectare of the polyculture. So agroecology then is a science that uses the elements of modern agricultural science, what we teach in our Western universities, but more importantly, uses traditional knowledge, the knowledge that farmers have produced over centuries of coevolution with nature, and then it transforms them into principles. There's a dialogue of wisdoms, and then those principles take different technological forms. But we need to be very humble about the knowledge of these people. For example, when I go to the Andes and I ask a farmer, how is your soil? And the farmer goes, it's a very good soil. You go like, God, I did a PhD in North Carolina State University and they never taught me that. Well, these people have different classification systems, a different way of reading nature, and that's where we need to incorporate that knowledge that has been, for centuries into this dialogue. And there's many reports that have come out from FAO, from IPES, from the IASTD, and so on, saying, yeah, agroecology is a fantastic thing, this is what we need for the future. The question is, why is it then that if it's so good, it's not basically spreading, being scaled? Well, there are many problems that have to do with lack of policies, right incentives, special markets, available research and education that is focused on agroecology. All that is true, but the real barrier to me is the corporate control of the food system by a bunch of corporations. Actually, 3 companies control just 60% of the commercial seed market, and so on and so on. So what we have is what we call the food empires, which are actually corporations that determine what producers produce, how much they're going to produce, for whom they're going to produce. If you think that farmers have a choice in the Midwest, you're wrong. Try to grow apples in the Midwest, you don't have any, the farm bill doesn't provide you incentives for that. So you're condemned to grow in those 3 things: corn, soybean, and hogs. And then you have also companies that determine, that the big supermarkets, Walmarts and so on, determine what you're going to eat, how much you're going to pay for it, and the quality of your food. So basically, this is the problem that we need to overcome. So the other thing is that many universities, after 50 years of silence, 30 years of silence about agroecology, because at the beginning they said, well, that's a bunch of communists and hippies that are talking about this. Then they criticized us and they said, no, actually agroecology cannot feed the world. Now they're co-opting agroecology, okay? And they're saying they discovered it. So 10 years ago, agroecology was barely recognized, and FAO now organized 2 conferences on agroecology. And what's happening is that there's a huge divide, because in those conferences, which I went to both of them, one group says agroecology is part of the solution with other solutions, like with biotechnology and transgenic crops and so on, to green the industrial system. For us, agroecology is the alternative to all that. There's a new paradigm that doesn't utilize these other technologies. So the question is, are we going to scale up agroecology, promoting agroecology by conforming to the dominant industrial food system, which is what's happened with organic farming? Organic farming is becoming corporatized and is only available for rich people. Or are we going to amplify agroecology via radical transformation? So it's the transformation versus the reformist here. So agroecology for us is a transformative science that proposes a political and technical strategy to change the industrial food system and to transform radically that system so that we can democratize the access of food for everybody, not just for the rich, that can afford the fair trade coffee and the organic produces and so on and so on. So the challenge that we have is how we're going to do the scaling up of agroecological initiatives to grow beyond isolated local experiences that exist throughout the world to include more farming families in larger territories. So let me go through very quickly, I think I have 20 minutes left, on how we have scaled up agroecology in Latin America, where I do most of my work. First has been the restoration of traditional farming systems, because it turns out that there are systems, for example, these systems called the waru-warus, which are in 3,000 meters above sea level, that allows the production of crops in the midst of frost, because the water absorbs the heat during the day and then releases at night, changing the temperature. Or the restoration of terraces, for example, in Cajamarca, Peru, where there's more than 1,200 hectares that have been already restored because of the advantages that these techniques have shown, the sustainability and resiliency through centuries. The other one is seizing opportunities from crisis. People say that we act when there's a crisis. Well, we are in a crisis, but it's kind of masked and we're not acting. But a country like Cuba had to act, because it turns out that by the end of the in early 90s, they went through, Soviet bloc collapse. They didn't subsidize them anymore, so there was a reduction of imports of fertilizer, pesticide, petroleum. Can you imagine tomorrow to Maryland we cut, the entrance of fertilizers and petroleum? What would happen? The whole thing would collapse. Well, that's what happened in Cuba, actually, with industrial agriculture, the state farms that were very industrialized. But the small farmers, here the corn, beans, wheat, rice, etc., you can see this is the contribution of the small farmers before the collapse. And this is the contribution of the small farmers after the collapse. So they were the ones that stood to the challenge because they were not depending on external inputs. They were using agroecological practices. And this is one example of one of those farms. There's about 130,000 farms that are following agroecological redesigns. This is in Santi Spiritu. This farm was a monoculture. It was transformed into this system. In this system, you can see that the dependence of external inputs went down to almost zero. There's no external inputs. It's just the ecological infrastructure of the system provides all the ecological services for production. And then you can see that they can produce enough protein per hectare to feed 34 people per year per hectare, and with an energy efficiency of 30. You put 1 kilocalorie, you get 30 back. Industrial agriculture has an efficiency of 1.5, so this is 20 times much more efficient in terms of energy. The other thing is building resilience. Well, we're seeing that many farms resist climate change. If you go to a region in Latin America where we have a network called Red Agres, where there has been a huge event, we find that there's 2,000 farms of which maybe 30 or 50 survived. And we want to know why. So for example, in Cuba, many farms that after hurricanes have survived. And actually now we have a training program bringing farmers from Puerto Rico and from Haiti to Cuba to learn about resiliency, how to design farms that are resilient to climate change. And what we have shown is that yes, there is a tremendous resiliency that can be transferred because there are principles that underlie the resiliency, a socio-ecological resiliency. The pastures, for example, in Colombia, can be when they are they're very productive when there's water and nitrogen. But when the drought hits, this is what happens. A lot of cows die. But you can transform these systems into silvopastoral systems, which I saw in the book that Hawking wrote. Well, actually, there are many, many farmers that are using this agroforest, agro-silvopastoral forest, where actually the condition of the animal increases, and also they're able to survive the drought. And you can see here that milk production stays stable despite the fact of the rainfall patterns. That's true resiliency. So we're trying to learn from these farmers what is it that explains the resiliency, so that those principles can be transferred to many other farmers. The other concept that we have worked with, and we continue working with, and we are building some lighthouses now in Colombia, is that farmers and scientists sometimes work together to design a model farm. It could be in a school, or it could be in a private farm. And then this farm basically provides examples. That's why we call it a lighthouse. Illuminates lessons to many people that come here and learn about the principles that govern the sustainability of this farm. So here in Cuba, you can see a 1 hectare farm. After 3 years of conversions, you could feed 5. The total production went up. You can feed 5 people instead of 4. And then actually the human labor went down as opposed to up, because actually when you establish what we call the ecological infrastructure and the rotations and everything starts working, your need for labor goes down. You don't need to weed so much, you don't need to put so much compost, and so on and so on. In Chile, we did a similar study back in the 80s in a half hectare, in 1 acre farm, and the question was, can we feed a family of 5 with 1 acre? Well, I don't have time to go into this, but if you go into my website, agroeco.org, there's many papers that go into the detail about this. And what we found is that this farm, after 3 years, was producing so much there was an output of excess food that could be sold to the local people. So these people started saving. The only thing they had to buy was oil and rice, and the rest were all produced in the farm. So they were saving $400 a month in food, the family of 5, and they were also having enough time now to actually process their food and sell it at a higher price. So they were food sovereign, and they did not depend on external inputs. So the cost of production went down about 70%. How does this knowledge spreads? Is through what we call the campesino methodology, which is basically a methodology. It's a grassroots movement of farmers that actually use some of the principles of Paulo Freire when he wrote the Pedagogy of the Oppressed, actually of spreading the knowledge between people in a horizontal way. And this is what happened in Cuba. There were 216 farmers using agroecology at the time of the collapse. You can see here now there's more than 130,000 farmers using this method, because the way it works is that you have a promoter, a leader from one community, it could be a man or a woman, that comes and teaches others, and those become teachers of others, and that's how it multiplies in a massive way. And this is one example in Central America using mucuna, which is a legume as a green manure, actually increased the production of biomass, of food, and more than 40,000 families adopted this in 3 years. The other thing that is happening is the restoration of territories. Many peasants are occupying land, or they gain control of a certain territory. For example, this is in the Mixteca Alta in Mexico, in Oaxaca. You can see that many peasants had to leave the region because of deforestation and overgrazing, but some of them stayed and started restoring the land. Because what was their future if they left the land? Go and come and work in California to be exploited, or work in Mexico City? So they stayed there, and they started soil conservation practices, water harvesting, and so on. And you can see now they have enough water to, depending on the amount of water that they harvest, how much land that they can devote for production. They are then reintroducing amaranth, which was a traditional crop, very rich in protein. And in a period of 5 years, more than 1 million trees were planted, and more than 1,000 farmers have been trained and have restored 500 hectares without any support from foundations or from government. This is in Colombia in 1992, in the Cordillera Occidental. You can see that this community started restoring the watershed because they didn't have any water. And then after a tremendous amount of work, community-based, including children, some of those children, this is 25 years ago, some of those children became PhDs in biology at the University del Valle and are working back in their community. And you can see that they were able to recover the forest cover in 75%, diversification of production, food security, and most importantly, the community cohesion increased, and there were more participation of women and children in all these efforts. So what agroecology is doing in Latin America is promoting a process that we call repeasantization. That means that they're becoming more farmers, more peasants again. By revitalizing small farms, moves peasants to autonomy from inputs and markets, and out of debt, which is very important because a lot of farmers are in debt, including the United States. 218 farmers per day go out of business in the US. And by recovering, reconfiguring, and restoring territories away from agribusiness, because agribusiness is taking over the land. For biofuels, for mining, many companies are going in the rural areas of Latin America for mining, so that we can get the metals for our iPhones, and so that Apple gets more rich. Like today, they made $1 trillion, they said, and they came out with a new phone that everybody's going to buy. Anyway, so how is agroecology spreading? It's not because there are professors like me in universities and so on and so on. Social movements took over. The rights in this country of the Afro-American people, the women, was because of social movement, not because some illuminated politician, came up with the idea. So agroecology has been taken by rural social movements like La Via Campesina, which is the largest peasant movement in the world, and is seen as a transformative science that can reshape the food systems. And why is agroecology compatible with social movements? Because it's socially activating, it's participatory, it's economically viable because it uses local resources, it's culturally appropriate because we respect the knowledge of peasants. We don't impose another type of knowledge. That was the Ring Revolution, was not the change of one variety for another, but basically knowledge for another. They suppress traditional knowledge, ecologically sound, and so on. And actually, Via Campesina, if you go to their website, you'll see that they see agroecology within what they call the food sovereignty framework as one of the most important pillars for transforming the food system. So you have the agroecological strategies, the social movements, and the state support, but very important in order to reach food sovereignty, access to land, access to seeds, access to water. And these movements have been so strong in some countries that have been able to shape policy. And for example, in Brazil, we have the national law of agroecology. And in other countries, many other initiatives. So how does that translate into practice? Well, today, because of the government that they have in Brazil, things have slowed down. But for example, there is this school lunch program where all the schools are forced to buy 30% of the food that they serve in the schools from small farmers. And that obviously activates the small farm. There's small farming community. There's 2,000 municipalities participating. They have to feed 45 million students per day. So farmers have to become organized. There have to be micro enterprises to produce, the cheese. So this is what they distribute, for example, in school in a particular region in southern Brazil. So we need to transform the corporate system into alternative food networks, but networks that actually work for the people. Because when I send my student to a Berkeley farmers market, you don't see any minorities there, you know. So these food empires, we can fight against them. Good luck. It's going to take a lot of work. Better, why don't we spend time developing a bypass where actually farmers control the territories and they create markets that are solidarious, not totally ruled by the capitalist system. Okay, so for example, in Colombia, in poor regions of Colombia, I know of some of these markets in which farmers sell their produce with the prices of 5 years ago, because they see, first of all, they use agroecology, so the cost of production are very low, and second, they're solidarious with their consumers, and the consumers solidarious with them. So agroecology has already reached millions of people, but it can spread more. And for that, we need supporting farmer-to-farmer networks, funding research and education at various levels on agroecology, the true agroecology. Enabling policy is important. Taking specific actions for empowering women, very important. And making strategic alliances. I saw there, alliances as one of the sustainability goals. But who's going to lead the alliances? The farmers, the peasants, not the scientists or the experts of the UN. It's the people that have to lead the alliances, and their agenda is non-negotiable, and we as scientists have to say whether we're going to support that political cause or not. So there's a social compromise here. This is not neutral. And second, there are some studies have been done about why agroecology has spread in some areas, not in others, and there are some very important ones. One of them is social organizations. It's a social fabric, the milieu, through which agroecology reproduces. So some people say, well, in the US it's a different story. Yeah, there's no social organization in many cases. We're talking about not just a little church group. We're talking about social movements that are going to be able to challenge the system. Networks for sharing experience and knowledge, the peasant-to-peasant mechanisms, effective practices, and all these others are important, but not fundamental. I mean, agroecology has spread, despite the fact that we have not received 1 cent from foundations. We have not actually received support from governments. In many places there are no policies, and it keeps spreading because despite the fact that you have a structure that is not conducive to the change, at the local level this change is happening and is spreading from farmer to farmer. Thank you very much.